Om, Om, Om. We'll continue with this meditation that was introduced as a 10th step, where it's primarily an introspection, observation, investigation of our notion of volition and freedom of will. Is really anything in our control, or all the events are really are not in my control and they happen as conditioned? Now continuing, the same insight is systematized by a second formula, which is known as the Satkarya Drishti. Satkaya Drishti. Both mean the same. Which is known as the Satkaya Drishti. The false view of individuality. The false view of individuality. That's what we talked about earlier also. Volition means individuality. False view of individuality. The belief in I and mine. It distinguishes 20 bases of the grasping at the word self. It distinguishes 20 bases of the grasping at the word self. Means when we say self, what is the basis on which it is coming? Grasping at the word self. By considering the possible relations of the 5 skandhas to the hypothetical self. So we are trying to identify these 5 skandhas and relate it to the self, and we identify 20 bases, 20 foundations. One regards 1 to 5 are the 5 skandhas as the self. Everyone thinks these skandhas, as we talked about earlier, this is my body, this is my shape, this is my color, height, weight. So this is something that people consider as their self, body as their self. In the Vedantic terminology, we call Sthula Sharira, means the gross body, as I am. The gross body is what I am, which causes sorrow because I am tall, I am fat, I am sick, I am strong, I am weak. All these things, because of our identification, causes sorrow, dukkha. So here, first of all, he is counting out of the 20 bases, 5 as the 5 skandhas. Without going into too much elaboration, for example, people say, I am such a miserable guy. I always have bad luck. So these are all identifications. So about related to pleasantness, and I always get a bad apple, you see. So pleasantness, unpleasantness. So whatever I do, I fail. So people have these notions, and then they are suffering. My past is bad. When people say I have a bad luck, my past is bad. So they think the samskaras which are manifesting now is myself. So they suffer. The consciousnesses, perceptions. People have dislike for the ideas they have. Oh, every idea that I get, that project fails. My ideas are wrong. They identify with that. But if you say the ideas come on their own and go, and you really have no relation with them, then the main connection for sorrow is disconnected. So we are trying to identify the basis of this individuality. First 5 are the 5 skandhas. As the 5 skandhas as the self. As the flame of a lamp is identical with its visual appearance, because we say body is the form and name, and it is the self. Just like the flame of the lamp is identified with its visual appearance. 6 to 10. The self as having or possessing the skandhas. Earlier we said skandhas as equal to myself. Now we say I possess the skandhas. I possess the skandhas. The self as having or possessing the skandhas. As a tree has a shadow. As a tree has a shadow. (11 to 15). The skandhas as in the self. The skandhas as in the self. As a scent is in the flower. So, first of all, skandhas equal to myself. Second is skandhas belong to me. Third is skandhas are in me. So that is the one. For example, he says, as the scent is in the flower. Last 5, 16 to 20. The self as in the skandhas. Earlier we said skandhas are in me. Now it's the reverse. The self is in the skandhas. As the gem is in the casket. As the gem is in the casket. Gem is in the casket. Similarly, the self is in the skandhas. So these are fundamentally the basis based on which we operate thinking about the self. I am in the body when we say, they are assuming in the last case where the self is in the skandha. Though we took a gross example, gross body. But the same thing with the, in the Vedantic terminology, subtle body and the causal body we say. Karana Sharira. So once you identify a Sharira and say, I am in that. Either you say, I am the gross body, or you say, the gross body is in me, or gross body belongs to me, or I am in the gross body. So the 4 way of seeing. Similarly, these 4 multiplied by the 5 skandha related becomes 20. So this is what is the basis based on which we need to do the examination. The 2 formulas derive their meaning from some idea of the self, Atman, which here is rejected. The 2 formulas that we mentioned earlier, they derive their meaning from some idea of the self or Atman, which here is rejected. That self is being rejected. At this point, we cannot be quite sure what notions of an Atman were envisaged by the early Buddhists when they so emphatically denied it. Because as we said, we do not have very much original Buddhism left. Because originally first 500 years was oral. We don't have any way to know what was the thinking at that time. Whatever we can conclude is based on what is left in the later literature and mentions as the previous inherited Buddhism. If we can separate that from the second level, as we talked about, the Sthaviras and the Abhidharma literature. From that generation of writings, whatever segments could be identified as belonging to the previous period is what we could say. But from this point of time, when the Buddhists said there is no self, what they really meant is not obviously very clear. We cannot very clearly decide on that. I personally believe that these notions were of 2 kinds. Means Edward Conze is saying. Number one, the ideas implied in the use of I and mine by ordinary people. The ideas implied in the use of I and mine by ordinary people. Number two, the philosophical opinion held by the Sankhya and Vaiseshika that a continuing substratum acts as an agent which outlasts the different actions of a person, abides for one or more existences, and acts as a support to the activities of the individual. So these two things are possible. Number one, by the time of Buddha's pronouncing anatta, he would have probably been referring to the general notion that people had about what they meant when they say I, mine, etc. And the second thing is, what was already in the available philosophical traditions at that time, especially the Sankhya and Vaiseshika doctrines, the philosophical opinion held by the Sankhya and the Vaiseshika, that a continuing substratum acts as an agent. So those two philosophies assume a continuing agent, continuing substratum acting as an agent, karta, bhokta, doer and enjoyer, which outlasts the different activities of a person. Even though the person is dead, that agentship continues. Abides for one or more existences, meaning it continues with multiple births and deaths, and acts as a support to the activities of the individual. So based on that, the activities of the individual in every existence is happening, which is a notion of Sankhya and Vaiseshika, the Hindu philosophies, which were prevalent at that time, from which the Buddhists argued a lot in the beginning. They tried to propose against those theories. It is, however, doubtful and a matter of much dispute among experts whether the Upanishadic doctrine of the Atman had any influence on early Buddhism. We, as Conze says, we have no way to determine whether this anatta was formulated against the Upanishadic doctrine of Atman, whereas Sankhya and Vaiseshika was possible because Buddha did interact with those philosophies in his beginning days. It is, however, doubtful and a matter of much dispute among experts whether the Upanishadic doctrine of the Atman had any influence on early Buddhism. But we also see many other literature in which they do point out to the Hindu, or they sometimes heretic, or even Tirthaka, they say, primarily Jaina and of course Hindu also, or heterodox disciplines other than Buddhism. That's what they mean. Whether the Atman, as we understand today in Vedanta, as one universal self, whether it was really known to the Buddhists at the time cannot be established. But we do see in literature, when they refer to Atman, they refer to an individual Atman as if the Hindus took it to be real. That is how the Buddhist books portray. But more often they refer to Saiva and Vishnu as the creators and so on. So which probably means that they are really not up to the current Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta thinking when Buddhist doctrine of anatta was propounded. So they must have taken that Vedanta, or in fact living Vedanta, Sankhya and Vaisheshika took as individual selves. When in general, what in general is suggested by soul, self, ego, or to use a Sanskrit expression Atman, is that in man there is a permanent, everlasting, and absolute entity which is the unchanging substance behind the changing phenomenal world. What in general is suggested by soul, self, ego, or to use the Sanskrit expression Atman, all these four words, what they really mean is that in man there is a permanent, everlasting, and absolute entity which is the unchanging substance behind the changing phenomenal world. Here also he is referring, the author is writing absolute entity, but here maybe it is not very clear as to whether it is one or many. But generally when you say absolute, it should mean only one. I do not personally think that they have agreed to a one Atman by the time of these pronouncements of Buddha about Anatman. Even if they were sure, they only meant that there were many individual Atman. So he was countering that. Buddha was countering that. Atman means anything substantially conceived that remains eternally one, unchanged and free. From Suzuki's study of Lankavatara, I think. Atman means anything substantially conceived. Substantially means tangible as a substance, conceived, that remains eternally one. Means the substance does not change, does not become many. Unchanged and free. Here, eternally one is also probably referring to one self of all. But I am not very convinced that at the time of this Anatta doctrine, the one self of all was so prevalent in the masses. Maybe it was there with the Upanishadic teachers and their students, but was not certainly a common understanding. We see this from the writings of Vedanta itself, where there are many other sects which propounded different other ideas of multiple Atman, until Shankara revamped and represented it as one self of all. In its core, the mark of not self is a simple corollary of the impermanence of everything. Here, this is what he means. When everything is impermanent, there is nothing. That is what he refers to. In its core, the mark of not self is a simple corollary of the impermanence of everything. There can be no lasting individuality because the skandhas have neither permanence nor unity, that is spinda. It should be noted that in the above basic formulas, the absence of a self is confined to the 5 skandhas, and that nothing is said either way about its existence or non-existence quite apart from them. The Buddha never taught that the self is not, but only that it cannot be apprehended. So here, Edward Conze is trying to nuance here and is trying to bridge the later ideas here by his justification here. Because here what happened is so far this topic of anatta has been talked about based on the 5 skandhas. Rupa skandha, which is the name and form skandha, or feelings, or vedana. Feeling is vedana. And then perceptions, and samskaras, or vijnana. These skandhas do not have a self. That is the only thing that has been taught so far. But it does not make a blanket statement saying, apart from these 5, also there is nowhere a self to be found. That is not the statement. So here Edward Conze is forwarding his opinion that it should be noted that in the above basic formulas, the absence of a self is confined to the 5 skandhas, and that nothing is said either way about its existence or non-existence quite apart from them. Buddha has not answered whether there is a self or no self if you leave these 5 skandhas behind. He has not commented. The Buddha never taught that the self is not, but only that it cannot be apprehended. The further developments of the anatta doctrine must be considered in relation to the dharma theory, so which will come in the part 2, dharma theory. And the dharmas are introduced in the later chapter here. An essential counterpart to the marks, to which often the repulsive ashubha is added as a 4th. Ashubha is added as a 4th, repulsive, as a 4th, or the 4 perverted views, viparyasa. Here comes the word perverted view or viparyasa. An essential counterpart to the marks. It's a counterpart to the marks. Means an opposition to that. To which often the repulsive or ashubha is added as a 4th. Means the 3 marks plus also ashubha. Or the 4 perverted views. So 4 perverted views are 4. But so far we mentioned 3 marks. So we also add the 4th mark called ashubha, means repulsive or not giving a good result. Not favorable, repulsive. 4 are the 4 perverted views. The perverted views are called viparyasa, which also form one of the more immediately convincing and readily intelligible items of the doctrine. This theory is fundamental to Buddhism, although not peculiar to it. So this is not really owned by Buddhism alone. It is available in the Hindu literature as well. Same way. This theory is fundamental to Buddhism, although not peculiar to it. But then there is no reason to assume that only the distinctive features of religion are vital to it. A very similar list occurs in the yoga system of Patanjali and Ch3's Buddha Charita attributes at least one side of it to the Sankhya teacher Arada. So he says a very similar list, like the 4 perverted views, occurs in the yoga system of Patanjali and Ch3's Buddha Charita attributes at least one side of it to the Sankhya teacher Arada. In Europe, This error of perspective has also not remained quite unnoticed, though professional philosophers have, on the whole, found the attribution of widespread and far-reaching self-deception to the human intellect rather distasteful. In Europe, this error of perspective has also not remained quite unnoticed, though professional philosophers have, on the whole, found the attribution of widespread and far-reaching self-deception to the human intellect rather distasteful. Its development was left to the psychologists and poets. It's trying to see why we make a mistake, why we do not recognize this impermanence and ill and not self and ashubha, which are associated unholy or yielding bad results, unfavorable situation about the life. European system doesn't want to accept it as an intrinsic defect of human personality, human mind, human intellect. Its development was left to the psychologists and poets. In England, Wordsworth's Ode to Immortality is known to all who went to school. Ode means a poem, a praise. Well known to all who went to school, and later on I will quote a poem by Sully Prudhomme which carries substantially the same message. Ode, say ode to immortality. After first explaining the meaning of the term viparyasa, I will say a few words about the perverted views as empirical mistakes which can be easily verified by ordinary observations within the reach of everyone. So the perverted views, this is what we want to understand now. Now, which is viparyasa. Conze says, after writing a few words about these perverted views, he wants to categorize them as empirical mistakes, which can be easily verified by ordinary observations within the reach of everyone. From that I proceed, by way of philosophical and psychological reasoning, to show that they are based on a misconception of our relation to the Absolute. So why do we have this viparyasa or the perverted views? Because he says, primarily because of our misconception of our relation to the Absolute. See, ultimately, any philosophy, at least Hinduism or Buddhism, says the same thing. For I am not able to understand what is this God or Absolute, then all the other mistakes happen. So misconceptions of our relation to the Absolute. He is talking about misconception of our relation to the Absolute, even here meaning that one is different from the Absolute, the sentences. But we don't need to be too perplexed, because after all, this is a long lecture in which different dimensions may come forward. The treatment of the viparyasa in the Mahayana will be discussed later as part 3. Okay. So what is interesting is, just like the ideas of impermanence, ill and not self, and ashubha or to be a repulsive nature. These are common themes in the Buddhistic thinking, whether it is the original Buddhism or whether it is the Abhidharma period or the Sthaviras or with the later Mahayanas. The same 4 concepts are dealt with. It's not that there are newer concepts. Only thing is a new way of dealing with them, not newer concepts. But the same four existing concepts are dealt with differently to take to a different depths of understanding. That is how it is. Lower vehicle and higher vehicle means Hinayana versus Mahayana means the depth to which they take these same four principles. And similarly, they also discuss about these perverted views into how they occur. That is also talked about even in the Mahayana. So we will see how it goes in further dealing with these four viparyasas into the next segments. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.